Audio check.
Okay. Teams audio check.
Morning. Slightly delayed start. We've got a few technical issues with microphones, and I think there's issues with Teams as well. So we'll start shortly, but yeah. Sting. Okay, good morning, everyone. The slightly delayed this morning, but the inquiry is resumed. A few housekeeping matters to go through this morning before we start with closing statements. Firstly, we'd like copies of the written copies of your closings, please. It helps us actually have them here to go through electronically or paper copies. So if you can send them, have them printed or send them to the programme officer, please. That would be very helpful. Just in terms of documents and things that are outstanding. We're awaiting the final 2 obligations. We've had another draft unilateral, and we know that that's still progressing. We're awaiting the final SIL compliance statement, and the council's note on the unilateral as well, just so we've got an understanding of any sort of concerns, etc. There was the table of transport information requested. We've got that, so that matter's closed now. Statement of common ground, we asked last week for the sort of final signed versions, if that can be submitted by the end of the week, please. Similarly, the sort of final list of conditions as well. Costs claims, we did set out the timetable last week, and we also sent that out in writing so that the Rule 6 parties that weren't here are aware of the process, etc. It's been mentioned quite a few times over the last few weeks, the Council's committee meeting and the recording of it. That's not been submitted in evidence. Can we have a copy of that, please, if it's going to be a major matter featuring in the costs?
I've got a feeling, and I might be wrong about this, that Amanda Sutherland, in one of her documents, did append a transcript of it.
Oh, okay.
I might be wrong. Let me. Yeah, I've got a document under her thing that's which I haven't checked, but I just noticed.
Okay.
That says all script, transcript of proceedings, North Somerset Council Planning and Regulatory Committee meeting held at the Town Hall on 10th of March, and then it is 10th of February, and then it seems to be a transcript.
Okay. Ms. Sutherland, are you there? Can you confirm if you have submitted that?
Good morning, ma'am. I wasn't aware that I had, so I'm a little bit concerned. So what I know I did do was submit a transcript of meetings running up to that in relation to ED12, but I'm not aware that I've ever had a full transcript of that meeting, actually. So I don't want to undermine Mr. Humphreys in any way, but I'm not sure that was me.
Okay. Well, perhaps if parties can just have a look behind the scenes,
Yes.
if there is that, and if it is going to be relied on in costs, can we have a copy, please?
Yes, it's very curious. I apologise if Ms. Sutherland didn't put it in, and I don't know quite why then I dropped it. I have folders for each party, and I've dropped it into her folder, and I will have done that, frankly, months ago, and I have no idea why then, but that does appear. I don't know whether Mr. Henderson knows about this.
I don't know. I mean, if it's something you request, madam, we can provide it to you. It won't be part of our submission. We'd be surprised, frankly, if it was part of anyone else's submission, given the approach that the courts take to collective decision making and the approach you should take to reading minutes and the reasons for a committee. Now, we can go into all of that detail in due course if a party does raise it as an issue, but I would say very clearly now we won't be putting that in as part of our application. We'd be concerned if anybody did. Okay,
thank you, Mr. Henderson. Well, we only want it if it's actually going to be relied upon. So, well, firstly, I suppose, establish if it's already there or not. And secondly, if it's not, if it's needed, please do. But if it's not needed, that's fine, because we've got quite enough reading to do, frankly. So, okay. All right.
It could be the link. It doesn't need to be a transcript. There's a link to the council YouTube channel, and it's on there. So
Yes.
it could just simply putting a link in the
Yes.
core documents or in the inquiry document.
Yes.
I think that would be the easiest.
Okay.
Mr. Clark.
Sorry, madam, I'm not sure if you're finished on this issue, but I wanted to come back to the statement of common ground. because we haven't really been involved in that process. I don't know what discussions have gone on concerning the statement of common ground.
I mean, all it was we've had the two statements of common ground. There's like the broad one and then the more detailed specific ones. They are in draft form, and all we were asking for was the final versions, but we don't want any new evidence or information as things have moved on in that. There might be things that need to be sort of scored out, but it was just so we've got a final completed document to work with, and it wasn't really for sort of further comment or involvement. And I think up front we sort of said a while back that the Rule 6 parties could comment on the draft, and we have all that information.
Well, I suppose my point is, as long as it's clear that we haven't agreed a statement of common ground,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so yeah, just that really.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay, we've also been made aware in respect of the legal challenge for Stansted that Mrs Justice Lang has refused the application for permission for review. So we're just putting that out there that we're aware of that, okay, for information. In terms of documents, we've had a few emails come in with various bits and pieces, who comments, some legal submissions, etc. So we've had those. The deadline for documents has now passed. We're not expecting anything else unless there's outstanding matters that we've asked for. There is the table we asked for last week in respect of the planning balance and the benefits, harms and the weight to that. I believe there's an email we've seen this morning to say that there is a delay. It was due at 10 o'clock, but there is a delay. We're fine with a small delay. I mean, we didn't anticipate it being a big job. It's just sort of a factual table. So I'm hoping it's not going to be too complex or anything like that.
I think it's one of those things that is sort of a great idea, particularly in its simplicity, but the trouble with the simplicity is rather more difficult. I think I think Mr. Melling probably over the weekend had sort of had a go at doing what he thought you wanted as a structure and sent with some blank boxes and sent it to the council. I think the council didn't feel that format was quite right, and I'm not sure, but I think has put something in this morning. What we were going to try to do was then replicate our views using that structure. The difficulty, I think, with it is that a lot of, you know, if you take a particular topic, I know, Greenbelt, that actually the sort of simple column of, right, what, you know, kind of what's the harm or what's the significance becomes actually quite a difficult task in itself. You know, the NPPF will tell you, look, you apply substantial weight to harm to a greenbelt. But what if the harm to the greenbelt is a slight weight or a negligible weight? What then weight do you attach to that? And I think we found it, and the council may have the same, quite difficult to put those complex ideas into a simple box with a, you know, a word or words next to it without it appearing that we're sort of departing from the evidence. So I think I'm obviously here, I'm not working on it, but I think people are trying to work on it to do something. But I think whatever we do, and the same will be this, of course, for the council, it's a necessarily and hopefully simplified representation, but it's not intended, whatever we produce, to change what the evidence was, if you see what I mean.
Which is
but
what we asked for,
we're working on that, and I know Mr. Henderson's and his clients have done the same. I haven't seen that, but I'm told that there is something.
Okay, Mr. Henderson.
Yes, there is a draft. We received the blank table that Mr. Humphreys referred to yesterday, late afternoon, and we've worked on it over the evening and provided a copy this morning, setting out how we think best to do the exercise. Clearly, BAL will want to look at that and will add their own comments, and that's absolutely fine. That's entirely for them. I am happy, though, to echo Mr Humphrey's concerns about the nature of the exercise. We will try our best to give it to you in a way that you've asked for and hopefully will assist you, but we do have pretty similar concerns to Mr Humphrey's about that, and hence I think why it's taken slightly longer than you'd originally hoped to do so.
Okay. All right. Do we, I mean, is lunchtime today a reasonable... Yeah. So I appreciate you're here and your colleagues are probably shouting at the screen right now.
They maybe will be screaming, no, don't say that. I genuinely don't know. In fact, I haven't seen Mr Melling this morning. I know he's working on these things. I'm sure people on the council side are. I just genuinely don't know. But I do know that you know, we just as the council know that you would like to see this and you want to see it as early as possible. That's why you set a deadline as 10 o'clock. You know, and I think we're both genuinely sorry that we haven't been able to do it, but we're trying to do something that is helpful, but without being sort of, you know, misleading, if I can put it like that.
Okay. All right. Well, I think perhaps in the mid-morning break, if we can just sort of find out where we are on it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think that's all on my list. Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. Well, can't quite believe we're saying this. We're doing closings. We've got a fairly paced out, steady week, which is good because, you know, the closings are important. They're really helpful to us. So we'll just sort of take it at a steady pace. Mr Humphreys.
One of the things that we might catch up on doesn't have to be today, but for those who are involved or potentially involved next week, where we think we might be, and that might be a discussion that we need to have informed by the programme officer. So we don't need to discuss it now, but I think we're quite keen to understand what may happen, what would be helpful to you. So I mention it now. I don't need any further guidance now, but I'd be really grateful for just a discussion.
Oh, just have to push harder. Yeah, we thought of this, and in fact, next week for the CPO, it's myself and Mrs. Searson, and we're going to have a chat with the programme officer at lunchtime today when we finish. I mean, I'll be honest, at the moment, I don't have a feel for it at all, but hopefully by tomorrow morning we will do, and so we can give those parties who are involved something more of a clear steer on this.
Okay, so first up then with, unless there's any other procedural matters. No? Okay, well, closing statements. So first on the list today is Balper, and it'll be Mr. Renshaw, who's with us on Teams.
Yes, good morning, madam.
Morning. Have you sent in a copy?
I haven't as yet. I will be sending one as soon as I've...
Could we ask you to do that now? It's really helpful for us to actually have something to read as well as listen to you.
Just
Pardon? Yes, she is. We have had, just while we're waiting, we've had the closing from Amanda Sutherland and the XR elders, so thank you for those. just to say we also have the PCAA closing through as well, so thank you.
Madam, is it possible, I don't need it in advance, I wouldn't be able to read it, but as each witness is about to give their closing, if the programme officer could circulate to others if that hasn't been done already. It may have been done already.
Hopefully she's nodding at the back there. So.
Thank you.
I wonder whether it might be best while you're waiting for this, if one of the other parties delivers their closings. I'm just about to send it.
Okay, I think next would be Ms. Sutherland. Are you happy to go now, Ms. Sutherland?
Good morning, ma'am. Yes, I'm quite happy to go now.
Yeah, okay, Mr. Venture, if you turn your camera off then, and we'll come back to you next.
Indeed.
Hopefully everybody's received a copy, and I hope it shan't be too long in terms of a closing submission this morning. BAL have submitted an application for a major expansion of operations, including further encroachment into the Greenbelt to provide surface parking. The application process was significant and considerable data and evidence were submitted to support the proposal. However, there are key documents that were not available and are still not available to the inspectors, without which we say the proposal cannot be properly considered in terms of its impact, both on the Greenbelt and on the wider environment. I'm aware the LPA will address the detail of their concerns in their closing, so I confine mine purely to the core case that I have presented, that allowing Greenbelt encroachment to deliver parking is contrary to all national and local policy, is inconsistent with all other inspectorate decisions, and that there are no very special circumstances to justify doing so. Whilst understandable, BAL have consistently relied upon the fact that officers recommended approval after review of the submission, with the implication that members were wrong to refuse. However, members were rightly acting on the significant concerns raised by their communities and did not agree with the officers. The fact that significant additional documentation has been submitted ever since the determination, and of course the whole new concept of monitor and manage has come forward, demonstrates that members were absolutely right to question the validity of the officer's opinion. BAL have had to significantly reconsider and update the evidence base on most key matters. Notable by its absence is the ASAS, upon which the whole scheme's environmental benefits rely. In particular, the appellant has failed to maintain or provide an up-to-date ASAS, maintain or provide an airport master plan. They failed as well to assess 20% of their parking provision, which is currently delivered off-site. They haven't accounted for off-site parking operator contribution towards public transport mode share in any of the assessments submitted on PTMS targets. In addition, the appellant has failed to consider the asserted parking need against the parameters of annual delivery, insisting that only an alternative that can deliver all of the parking demand to 2030 can be considered a suitable alternative. In doing so, they discount the variety of opportunities available to them to increase public transport mode share put forward by Rule 6 parties. Disaggregation of this need to ensure sustainability of delivery is an acceptable approach that BAL have failed to address. I gave an example to Mr. Mellon in this respect in my cross-examination, that the airport could simply submit an application to meet a need to 2040 instead, and declare a need for 40,000, 50,000 spaces. Not all of those spaces are needed now, but it would probably be possible to justify them over such an extended time frame. That should not preclude limiting the application to the current identified need, as opposed to a potential need that may arise in the future and which is disputed by all parties other than BAL. Specifically addressing current need, can be adequately done in the GBI to cover at least the next few years on BAL's own figures. Any future need in the Greenbelt should be assessed when it arises, as very special circumstances cannot be demonstrated unless need is demonstrated. Further, it's unrealistic to fail to assess alternatives on the basis Mr. Melling suggests. No single option would, on its own, meet the whole need. BALPA suggests repositioning staff parking. PCAA and the LPA insist that MSC, P2 and PTI should be delivered first. XRL does suggest decked parking. SPLS suggests park and ride. The reality here is that the airport do not wish to consider these alternatives. They are a profit-driven business. Indeed, the BAL case of reliance on a need for low-cost parking is clearly mythical. The airport needs more parking regardless of type, and this was accepted by Mr. Melling in cross-examination and demonstrated clearly by Mr. Renshaw in his evidence. For this application, the appellants focused on low-cost parking because they consider that this assists them in justifying the need for Greenbelt encroachment. Not because it's unviable or undeliverable to utilise GBI first, simply financially preferable. It goes without saying that the airport will never support off-site park and ride unless required to do so by the LPA, as their profit base for parking is a third of their annual income. The commitment from the appellant to review and be aware of park and ride schemes is somewhat undermined by the fact that BAL failed to identify either of the two proposed sites in their Greenbelt sequential testing exercise, and indeed sought to blame the LPA for the list of identified sites. Once made aware of them, BAL objected to both of them in detail. The Joint Transport Local Plan says more must be done to facilitate improvements necessary to airport surface access, and specifically mentions park and ride options alongside a mass transit potential. BAL asserted that this was a long way off in evidence, and that this aim of the JLTP will not be met. Although a park and ride may be a long way off in the appellant's view, the LPA, through the Joint Local Transport Plan, aspire to it now. My client aspires to it now. 2 applications have been submitted. More will no doubt follow. I am unconvinced that Mr. Melling's opinion on this is realistic or objective. Consenting this scheme without any consideration of park and ride as an option outside the Greenbelt will effectively prevent consideration of that option until at least 2030, representing a continuous lack of compliance with the local transport plan. If the inspectors do consider consent, then I would suggest that a parking forum that represents all lawful parking operators would be a less biased approach to the SASG suggested by BAL to inform any future review and ensure all options are explored. And for the inspectors to note, this ties in with my comments made on the Section 106 and conditions in relation to the fact that there's simply no controls whatsoever on how monitor and manage, etc., could possibly be delivered, nor is there any public engagement involved. There are many local landowners who use their permitted development rights to lawfully provide car parking to serve airport customers, as well as those with incidental parking operations alongside hotels, bed and breakfast. These are all local businesses creating local employment lawfully in the rural area, and who are understandably angry at being lumped into a pot with nuisance parkers in the villages. I set out in my in my note on conditions a small paragraph in relation to the range of airport parkers, which I think are relevant for this point. The airport have accepted that they have no evidence of how many off-site spaces are provided lawfully, and have not commented on the figures that I submitted in this respect, nor have they entered into discussion with either alternative scheme promoter for lawful park and ride applications. Instead, they objected strongly to both. Part of the proposal is the creation of additional ground level car parking on greenbelt land, expanding the periphery of the site further into the greenbelt alongside the permanent retention of the seasonal car park. In putting forward the appeal proposal, BAL carried out a locational sequential assessment of alternative available sites and concluded there were no other sites available. At the time, the airport were fully aware of the proposed alternative Mead site, but failed to assess or consider it on the basis they initially considered there was insufficient information about it to do so. During the inquiry, the refusal came in for Heathfield Park. This refusal was based on the principle under DM30 that providing airport parking off-site and the potential conflict with the ASAS creates an in-principle refusal reason. BAL take the view that as it is refused, it is not a suitable alternative. That is to ignore the fact that the BAL scheme has also been refused, and that the key reason for refusal at Heathrow appealed is an out-of-date policy, subject to review, that is non-compliant with the more recently adopted Joint Local Transport Plan. At present, DM30 provides a strict constraint to airport parking outside the Greenbelt than DM50 does to the airport operating in the Greenbelt, despite the higher protections afforded to Greenbelt land established in national policy. It's my fear that unless the airport make provision within an ASAS for the potential for park and ride, then any such scheme will be considered unable to meet the ASAS. This puts alternative proposals in the unenviable position of having no input to the ASAS, having planning decisions based on a document produced by a private business that have clearly got an interest in preventing competition. It's essential that an ASAS or an AAP is in place to inform these wider decision-making on expansion schemes involving increased parking requirements. The LPA enshrined in policy the need for an AAP to engage local communities and consider more comprehensively how airport growth need can be planned rather than simply reacted to. The airports say only that the LPA have no AAP, whereas without their input, I believe the council are unable to create one. Such a policy needs to be delivered in a cooperative partnership, and the airport have made it quite clear they do not intend to engage in such a process. That was their position 10 years ago. That remains their position. The airport proposal for the additional element of car parking is accepted as inappropriate development in the Greenbelt by BAL. Yet the proposal concludes very special circumstances exist due to the absence of alternative provision. I should add in here as well, just a brief further sentence. The airport fail to assess Greenbelt impact consistently with all other inspectorate decisions, which give significant weight to harm to the Greenbelt openness. And I'll carry on reading. The evidence demonstrates that this aspect of the BAL proposal is completely unjustified and inappropriate and doesn't benefit from any very special circumstances that would allow the inspectors to conclude acceptability in the Greenbelt. The very special circumstances pleaded are that there is need and that the airport is a major operator. These are quite clearly insufficient, given these are matters discussed in detail in evidence. One of the biggest issues arising from the proposal is the impact on local people living on the A roads and in villages surrounding the airport, and the number of vehicle movements generated every day by the airport, with attendant effects on air quality, noise, and the impacts on climate change arising from the proposal. It is unsustainable to continue to allow BAL to expand and encroach into the Greenbelt when other more suitable off-site provision can be delivered without impact on the services the airport provides and without further development in the Greenbelt. The airport passenger numbers have grown by over 40%, from 5.8 MIPA in 2011 to 8.2 by 2017. The appeal application proposed a further 50% growth to 12 MIPA, with an overall ambition to have 20 MIPA. The airport states that the current airport car parking facility is running at 95%. I haven't seen any evidence of that. This is with passenger numbers at 8.2 and demonstrates that in such a scenario, there is already insufficient parking for the already consented 10 MIPA, let alone the 12 MIPA applied for. It's clear that increasing passenger numbers increases airport car parking spaces. Even though the application was refused, Bristol Airport can still expand by an additional 1.8 million passengers a year under the existing consent. Insufficient parking has been delivered to meet this need, despite it being consented already. By this, I'm referring back to the 2011 consent, MSCP2 and the PTI, that the airport have had consent for 10 years, but not delivered. It's considered that over the years, the airport have vastly understated their parking needs throughout the planning history. There will be more to come, and this piecemeal encroachment into the Greenbelt is completely unacceptable. Finally, no assessment of current off-site airport parking operations has been included in the calculations provided by the airport. In the absence of an assessment of 20% airport parking, BAL cannot with any certainty provide a realistic assessment of the parking arising from their operation of the airport, nor any accurate information on public transport mode share. Just to add in there, we heard in evidence in relation to public transport mode share that 90% of off-airport car parkers use minibuses to take their customers to the airport and are counted by the CAA as public transport under their own definition in the Section 106. For these reasons, we respectfully request the appeal is dismissed. BAL should be asked to reconsider submission only once they've addressed these key documents necessary for both the main parties to properly consider a planned need for expansion for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sutherland. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Renshaw, do we have your version? I've not had anything through yet.
I did send something through about a quarter of an hour ago, 20 minutes ago.
Right, it's obviously not made its way into my inbox yet.
Joanna did ask me, and I had sent it, I think, pretty much by the time she'd asked.
Okay. Just bear with us, Mr. Renshaw. We'll just...
I have it in, it's been circulated at 9:57, if that helps, from Joanna Vincent.
Okay, it's not landed in our... Have you got... No. Ms. Vincent, if you can hear me, if you can just resend it, because none of us have got it.
Oh, yes, just
Ah.
got it on the screen.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Mr. Renshaw.
Yes, am I good to go?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Oh, thank you, madam.
I think it's
Well,
called
within
a
the
satellite.
context of
Sorry.
within the context of the wide range of issues which have been addressed at the inquiry, Balpa's case concerns only a relatively narrow area of the appeal. That should not obscure the importance or validity of the points that Balpa makes. Principally, it is Balpa's case that the appellant has not considered the reasonable alternative to the proposed extension to the Silver Zone car park of the relocation of the staffed car parking area within the Greenbelt inset. The failure to consider seriously this reasonable alternative undermines BAL's case that the very special circumstances test has been met in respect of the airport's proposal to use 3.73 hectares of additional Greenbelt land for 2,700 low-cost parking spaces. In addition, BALPA contends that the parking strategy is in conflict with policy CS11. The breach of policy CS11 relates to the issue of staff travel and future staff parking requirements, where BALPA demonstrated that even if the challenging target of no more than 70% of staff travelling in single occupancy vehicles was achieved, there would still be a considerable increase in staff travelling to work by car and seeking parking at the airport. The draft workplace travel plan states clearly that no additional staff parking will be provided, even at 12 million passengers per annum. Following a ruling from the inspectors, BALPA did not pursue the argument that was made in its statement of case and in its proof of evidence that there are significant flight safety implications arising from the separation of the staff car park from the north side of the airport. Turning to Greenbelt very special circumstances and reasonable alternatives, in its evidence, BALPA demonstrated the current inefficiency of using land within the Silver Zone car parking area for parking staff vehicles due to the differing parking arrangements for staff and passengers in the Silver Zone. No evidence was produced by the appellant to dispute BALPA's calculations that the 1,000 staff car parking spaces in the Silver Zone area could yield at least 1,400 spaces for passengers. Mr. Hatton considered in paragraphs 17 and 18 of his proof of evidence that this was a conservative estimate. Neither was there any challenge to the calculations produced by Mr. Hatton in Appendix J of his proof that if staff were to revert to parking in the Greenbelt inset, the net financial cost to the airport would be negligible. There was no challenge either to the further benefit on sustainable transport grounds of BALPA's parking strategy from the calculation that over 150,000 miles per annum run by BAL's buses taking staff to and from the staff car park to the airport could be avoided, paragraph 6.23 of my proof, as well as the financial benefit to BAL of not having to operate the staff park and ride service. Unlike the council, BALPA did not challenge the calculations of parking demand set out in BAL's parking demand study and the parking demand study update. However, what was not understood or accepted in answers given in cross-examination by Mr. Witchells on day 20 or Mr. Melling on day 30 was that BAL's calculated total requirement of parking need at 12 million passengers per annum fails to distinguish between low-cost requirement and premium-priced parking provided within multi-storey car parks. Mr. Witchell referred to the model which established a demand profile, but no evidence is available as to the outcome of the model in terms of the need for low-cost or premium car parking. Document INQ 52 showed that as a result of the provision proposed at 12 million passengers per annum, in accordance with the application details, the nature of the parking would look very different in type to what it does today. The higher cost premier parking in multi-storey car parks would amount to 26% of the total, compared with 11% currently. Low cost provision would correspondingly drop from 70% to just under 63%, which does not correspond to the findings of the PDSU. There is a clear inconsistency between the balance of parking proposed and likely demand. BAL's evidence is that it seeks to provide low-cost parking as a priority to reduce the demand for unauthorised off-site parking in the Greenbelt. BAL says that unless low-cost parking is provided at an early stage, demand for surface parking from passengers will likely be met by unauthorised parking in the Greenbelt. Provision of multi-storey car park 3 is of lower priority, and, as BALPA pointed out, the phasing of MSCP provision proposed as part of the airport's expansion to 10 million passengers per annum was deferred for demand and financial reasons, as set out in paragraphs 3.16 to 3.121 of Mr. Renshaw's proof. BALPA has proposed a means by which 1,400 additional low-cost spaces can be provided, which would not otherwise be available and at a very early stage without the need for planning permission. BAL's highways and planning witnesses both argue that this would cause a lack of spaces in the north side car parking area, which is more expensive. Mr. Hatton's proof of evidence, paragraphs 19 to 22, disputes this, and BAL has not provided actual data to support its case. The inspectors will have to come to a view on this. In examination in chief on day 20, Mr. Renshaw advised that currently all staff are parking in the north side multi-storey car park without any capacity issues. BALPA also considers that the reallocation of staff parking north side will, through increasing demand for parking there, itself help to bring forward demand for multi-storey car park 2 and 3. No response has been made by the appellant to this argument, other than the assertions that the airport needs all the spaces it has made provision for in its application. BALPA acknowledges that its option does not avoid the need for the airport to expand low-cost parking into the Greenbelt, but it does reduce the extent and defer the need to do this, potentially allowing other solutions to the need to expand into the Greenbelt to come forward in the meantime. BALPA fails to understand the airport's resistance to its simple strategy that would add to the provision of low-cost parking which BAL's evidence said will be most needed, without requiring further incursion into the Greenbelt at an early stage. BAL failed to consider this strategy when asked to do so by the Council during consideration of the application, and has offered the same response to BALPA outside of this inquiry. It follows that the failure by the appellant to consider the reasonable alternative to the Silver Zone extension of relocating some or all of the staff car parking to the Greenbelt inset nearer to the terminal undermines BAL's very special circumstances case. Turning to staff travel and adequacy of parking, Core Strategy Policy CS11 requires that adequate parking must be provided and managed to meet the needs of anticipated users. The strategy set out in the draft Workplace Travel Plan is to provide no more staff parking than is available at present. Mr. Witchells acknowledged in cross-examination on day 20 that not increasing staff parking would be a challenge, and he indicated that this was a requirement of the Council. If so, neither the Council nor BAL are being realistic, nor acknowledging what the text of Policy CS11 says, that despite its commitment to sustainable travel, the Council acknowledges that cars are still essential for many journeys in the district, and people will still need space to park. BALPA has recognised that the airport is rightly looking to promote sustainable travel, but has pointed out the issues arising due to unsocial shift working undertaken by 60% of the workforce that makes this difficult for the majority of the workplace to consider. Paragraph 6.3.1 of my proof. In cross-examination on day 20, using Table 312 of the Transport Assessment Addendum provided by the appellant and Table 6.9 in Mr. Witchell's proof of evidence, I was able to demonstrate that even if the challenging target of no more than 70% of staff travelling in single occupancy vehicles is met, the employment forecast for 12 million passengers per annum suggests that a further 491 staff cars would be travelling to the airport above baseline numbers, leading to the need for just under 400 extra spaces. Accordingly, BALPA has demonstrated that the parking strategy for staff is contrary to Core Strategy Policy CS11. To conclude, BALPA agrees with the Council that BAL has not demonstrated that very special circumstances exist to justify the extent of the incursion into the Greenbelt. This is because BAL have not considered the alternative to the proposed extension to the Silver Zone car park of relocating staff parking to the north side of the airport closer to the terminal. During this inquiry, it has been shown that the relocation of staff car parking would be reasonable. It is readily and easily achievable without the need for planning permission. There is sufficient capacity in the Greenbelt inset area to accommodate the relocated staff car parking, including within the existing and consented multi-storey car park. BAL have failed to counter BAL's evidence. BAL have failed to counter BALPA's evidence, there's a typing error there, madam, which indicates that the relocation would not be financially disadvantageous to BAL. This is a reasonable alternative that BAL could and should have considered before applying for an extension of the Silver Zone car parking to the extent proposed. In addition, for the reasons above, BALPA considers that the parking strategy for staff is contrary to Core Strategy Policy CS11. BALPA has considered the wording of the different conditions proposed by the Council and the appellant to address the issue of airport parking, condition 6. Neither of these address the concerns raised by BALPA, so BALPA has provided a form of words which would at least go some way to addressing the concerns BALPA raised. BALPA's suggested amendment to the Council's proposed condition would have the effect of preventing the expansion of car parking into the Greenbelt until and unless unless BAL had shown to the satisfaction of the Council that the relocation of the staff car parking to the Greenbelt inset was not feasible. This condition is necessary because it is only when it has been demonstrated that the relocation of the staff parking is not a reasonable alternative, would special circumstances exist for the extension of the low-cost parking into the Greenbelt to the extent proposed, subject, of course, to the consideration of the other arguments in this respect by the Council and others. BALPA's suggested amendment to BAL's proposed condition requires that as part of the annual parking demand and capacity report, there is a review of the feasibility of relocating the existing staff car park from the silver zone within the Greenbelt to a location within the Greenbelt inset. This is less satisfactory because it leaves much to be agreed at a later date, which provides little certainty that BALPA's objection can be overcome. Unless the inspectors are persuaded that the conditions proposed address the omission in BAL's very special circumstances case, the appeal should not be upheld. Neither condition would overcome the concerns raised in relation to the inadequacy of the parking strategy, insofar as it addresses future staff parking need, and therefore without a suitable condition in this respect, upholding the appeal and granting planning permission would be unsafe for this reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Renshaw. Thank you. Okay. Next, we have XR Elders, Ms. Beth.
Okay, am I
Yes.
loud and clear? Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay, so we've got to the end of a very long inquiry, and XR Elders are grateful to the inspectors for their patience in considering the reams of evidence. This is a summary of our evidence as presented to the inquiry, which did not cover every aspect of the proposal and its impacts. We specifically dealt with surface access issues, development on the green belt, impact on the AOMB, and forecasting inaccuracies and their implications. So I'll deal with these in turn, discussing the planning policy implications as I proceed. And although I've given references in the document, I'm not intending to read them out. So to start with impact...
Sorry, Ms. Beth. Ms. Anderson? I've got an electronic copy. Have you not? Yes, it should.
It's all right.
I don't have one either in this case.
Right, okay. We've got it this time. We've switched. I'm happy to pause just for 5 minutes.
It's not a problem. It's not a problem.
If it can be recirculated, because it is easier to have a written transcript in front of us as well. So, right, if that can be circulated to the parties. And I'm hoping that everyone else will have everyone else's cross-copied as well.
Actually, if I'm doing a presentation, I do try to not circulate the written copy while I'm doing it, because people do tend to read and not listen. But, I'll wait. Has it come? No.
Got a few nods around the room. Mr. Humphreys, have you... Yes. Great. If you want, you can start again, Ms. Beth, or take
No,
it from
I'm
where
fine.
you... Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the first issue, impact on the AONB. Adverse impact on the Mendip Hills AONB was not a reason for refusal, although in our opinion it should have been. Bristol Airport is 3 kilometres north of the AONB boundary, and activity at the airport, including vehicle traffic as well as aeroplanes, impacts significantly on the AONB and its setting. The landscape character areas discussed in Ms Tudor's proof demonstrate this. It was accepted at the inquiry that the setting of the AONB includes that section of the airport site that slopes down to the south from the runway. The landscape here is complementary to the AONB and forms a valley from which the AONB rises to the south. The southern section of the airport site is visible from many places on the slopes up to the northern ridge of the AONB opposite the airport, as demonstrated well in Appendix B of Mr. Belling's rebuttal proof. The MPPG states that land within the setting of an AONB often makes an important contribution to maintaining their natural beauty, and that poorly located development can do significant harm. Tranquility is a special quality of the AONB that contributes to its natural beauty. Increased aircraft and road traffic arising from the development proposals will all adversely impact on the tranquility of the AONB, which is already being eroded by the number of aircraft movements below the sensitive 7,000-foot height, as Mr. Fumicelli's proof showed. The evaluation of impact of the proposed 13 extra low-level flights a day over the AONB were assessed by Bickerdike Allen as not significant, as they only amounted to a small average increase in noise. While this may be a legitimate measure of noise impact, it is not a legitimate measure of impact on tranquility, where the noise event of a low-flying aeroplane breaks the enjoyment of an otherwise peaceful rural landscape. It is a point Mr. Fumicelli also makes. In his opinion, the environmental statement is silent on the issue of tranquility and how the proposed development may adversely affect it within the AONB and its setting. The process of, I'm going to say Livia, it's the Landscape Valuation Impact Assessment, Livia, set down in Livia 3, which is the guidance the Landscape Institute provides, is largely followed, but associated guidance within Livia 3 is not, serving to downplay the assessment of significance. For example, criteria used to inform magnitude of change contribute to the unsatisfactory assessment of significance, leading to an unsafe conclusion that effects of the development proposal are minor and not significant. During the presentation of her evidence, Ms. Tudor pointed out that there were two different matrices of EIA significance. Had Table 4.1 in the environmental statement been used, I think that was the methodology section there, in the Livia, then a more balanced and informed assessment of significance of effects might have been reached, with 5 levels of difference used. The table in the Livia has only 4 levels of difference, which oversimplifies assessment. Given the weight government places on nationally designated landscapes, the AONB should be assigned a very high value overall. But this is not available in the Livia table. Mr. Ferber stated in cross-examination that this is because it is already impacted by the airport. This is true, but does not justify the AONB being less valued in an assessment of the impact of new development. The proposed Silverstone extension into the Greenbelt has an adverse impact on the AONB because it is on the southern slope of the airport site within the setting of the AONB. Besides the visual intrusion of acres of parked cars and vehicle movements, there will also be adverse impact on tranquility from increased lighting and intermittent lights and headlights after dark. Dark skies are also a special quality of the AONB. The MPPF requires that nationally designated landscapes and their setting should have great weight attached to the conservation and enhancement of landscape and scenic beauty. The Development Plan Policy DM11 states that development with an adverse impact on the AONB and setting should not be permitted unless it is in the public interest to do so. And I think there's a slight typing error there. Should not be permitted. Policy CS5 of the core strategy requires development to conserve and enhance the natural beauty of the AONB. It is our view that in order to properly implement national policy and their own development plan policies, North Somerset officers should have given greater weight to the need to conserve and enhance the AONB. Our concerns are shared by representations to North Somerset from the AONB Partnership and Natural England. Officers should also have considered whether the progressively adverse impact of the airport and its traffic on the AONB over the years needed to be halted. That the public interest may no longer be served by overlooking one more adverse impact judged not significant in the interests of further growth of the airport. Excuse me. So, second issue, surface access. Much of the airport site is dedicated to providing car parking, and BAL has a high private car journey modal share compared with other airports, as shown in the CAA statistics. This leads to very significant pressure for places to park, both on and off site. Policy W1 in the Joint Local Transport Plan requires the improvement of public transport options, and Policy W3 in this document supports demand management for modal shift from private car use, including using parking charges to do this. The Development Plan Policy DM50 requires improvements to public transport as part of any development within the Greenbelt inset of the airport, and national policy also requires the promotion of public transport and sustainable travel modes. The solution, then, to relieving local environmental problems caused by this parking pressure is encouraging more journeys to be made on public transport, as required by policy. Parking enforcement and restrictions, possibly including residence parking schemes, will also be needed. We have argued that support measures for public transport to date, and proposed within this application, are not robust enough for the very significant additional travel requirements of the proposed 20% increase in passengers. None of them address the issue of reducing the cost of public transport to make it more attractive. There is a small subsidy of the flyer service already. This needs to be reassessed with cheaper ticket costs. We have shown that in the major market of Bristol, the airport flyer is not competitive for couples and families travelling together, particularly with the additional time and financial cost of getting to the bus and the extra inconvenience of managing luggage on public transport. The high price of the airport flyer from Bristol Temple Meads also impacts on rail journeys to the airport from further afield. Negotiations with Metrobus and extending the route to the airport should have been worked up as part of the application, particularly in view of the support for this in Policy W2 of the Joint Local Transport Plan. The transport interchange should have been an integral part of the development proposals. This development was required as part of the previous permission to expand to 10 MPPA, but was not constructed prior to this application being lodged. Given the policy requirements and planning history, I find it unacceptable that the negotiations on this development proposal did not include a transport interchange as part of the development. And the severe restrictions on using taxis to get to the airport affects those such as the disabled and elderly who have no other option besides informal drop-off. The approved monopoly taxi company for the airport is substantially more expensive. The proof of Mr. Witchell shows the ASAS hierarchy ranking journeys by private car parked at the airport above taxi use, even when that taxi has a fare each way. This is contrary to all sustainable travel hierarchies, which aim to reduce travel by private car. Department of Transport acknowledge that taxi journeys are part of the wider public transport offer. They support lower car ownership and widening access to mobility, especially for people who cannot drive themselves. They are a legitimate alternative to the private car for journeys to the airport at unsocial hours, when public transport services are reduced. The ASAS, in its promotion of sustainable travel, needs to recognise that the carbon footprint of alternative travel modes is more complex than the number of journeys made. Encouraging car ownership and building car parks both increase carbon emissions. So next issue, car parking, and there is some overlap with green belts here. I mean, they were so entangled. So BAL and North Somerset Council officers agreed that the provision of low-cost parking discourages people from choosing to use public transport. BAL, however, only acknowledges this problem in the context of off-site parking provision, which is priced on average at about £50 for a week. Off-site parking is often collectively referred to as unauthorised, although, as Ms Sutherland has pointed out, a considerable proportion of the off-site provision would appear to be legal. There is no data on this. Besides legitimate parking businesses around hotels and other sites, there is the use of land during the summer peak demand under permitted development rights. Those that are not legal are quite rightly enforced against, and the action of BAL in supporting this is commendable. It is agreed by all that parking provision in the Green Belt is inappropriate development, and various enforcement and appeal decisions support this. BAL seek to justify their proposal to intensify and develop new parking areas in the Green Belt by arguing that only in this way can they provide lower cost parking that will effectively compete with the unauthorised off-site park provision. It would not be a legitimate planning concern, of course, if they were looking to more effectively compete with legal off-site providers. In fact, BAL's ability to compete with alternative providers with low overheads and an inferior product may be limited. Cheaper parking on the airport may just drive off-site parking prices down, further reducing the competitiveness of public transport use. If BAL are serious in their intentions to promote sustainable travel, there is a fundamental flaw in the argument that they need to compete with off-site low-cost parking. Low-cost parking is acknowledged to take modal share away from public transport. If BAL effectively compete at the low-cost end of the market, then they will also undermine attempts to shift modal share towards greater public transport use. The Joint Local Transport Plan specifically refers to the need to limit the increase in demand for car parking at the airport. BAL argues that prioritising the expansion of lower-cost surface parking is needed because this is the only measure that can improve the parking problems in residential areas and avoid a significant increase in unauthorised off-site car parking. Beyond alternative measures I've already discussed to reduce these problems, there is also an indication in the parking demand study that a natural upper limit to the opportunities for off-site parking may have been reached. The study states, "We assume that the proportion of on-airport parking increases over time, due in part to limited possibilities of further unauthorised expansion in the Green Belt." The case for extending the Silver Zone car park to better compete with off-site provision and reduce adverse impacts on residents is further undermined that although the Silver Zone car park has been operating from 2017, no such benefits were evident prior to the pandemic. So just a bit on viability. A review of the costs of car parking at the airport reveals a complex pricing strategy based, it would appear, on date of travel, current demand and location of the parking. Silver zone quotes are frequently not low cost or that much less than other parking options in the Greenbelt inset. Missing word there. So a complex algorithm is determining the price of parking and will be maximising the return it makes over all available airport sites, something it is quite reasonable for a business to do. BAL have provided legal opinion that the LPA, Local Planning Authority, cannot control the price of car parking at the airport in any legal agreement. So there can be no effective limitation placed on the pricing of the proposed additional Greenbelt parking, and no guarantee that it would be competitive with off-site provision. And as I said before, indeed, if it were, it would further discourage the use of more sustainable modes of travel. The pricing structure evidence and variation within it as to particular product and times indicates that the algorithm BAL uses for pricing car parking operates over the whole product range. Prices vary, it would appear, with the current demand and capacity at the site, together with the distance from the airport, whether a bus is needed for transport on, and quite possibly other factors. So I'm not qualified to comment on assertions as I heard them from Mr. Melling that competition law could also apply to a business applying internal cross-subsidy between their products, and that for this reason pricing has to be proportionate to the cost of construction. However, the pricing structure at the airport strongly suggests that cross-subsidy between products, such as a multi-storey car park and the Silver Zone, is currently operating. Our estimate of construction costs suggests they are nearly 3 times greater for a multi-storey car park compared with surface parking, a difference which is not reflected in the quotes for these two products. Price primarily reflects the relative attractiveness of parking products, not the construction costs. BAL's justification for providing cheaper parking in the Greenbelt is also based on customer preference for low-cost parking that they need to provide. Preference for lower prices is hardly surprising. Customers generally prefer lower costs where the product is broadly similar. But when low costs have adverse implications, they need to be resisted. Cheap airport parking leads to the suppression of demand for public transport, with resulting problems of increased traffic, pollution, and parking pressure on the Green Belt. As the average household income of leisure passengers is over $50,000 a year, according to the 2019 CAA survey, low prices are not required in order that the product is affordable for the customer base. So viability is a planning issue, and if it was not possible for BAL to provide the extra parking required at an economic rate, then consideration of cheaper sites within the Greenbelt would have some justification. However, no viability study supporting the need to build car parking with cheaper construction costs in the Greenbelt has been provided, or been required to be provided by North Somerset Council officers. There is no evidence that it is essential for BAL's business that they provide additional parking in the Green Belt. Just to finish on this topic, negotiating better public transport provision and reducing parking requirements at the airport should have been undertaken by the local planning authority. BAL cannot be blamed for not offering proper support for public transport. It will directly impact on their profitability, and they have a duty to shareholders to maximise this. With this conflict of interest made it imperative that the local planning authority ask for robust evidence, including viability evidence, before accepting proposals for inappropriate car parking development in the Green Belt. And I will move on to Green Belt issues now. They're sometimes hard to separate, really. So it's been generally accepted that BAL gave 3 overarching reasons for there being very special circumstances that justified their proposed development in the Green Belt. The first, that there is a need for low-cost parking that can only be provided in the Green Belt, I have dealt with already and discounted. There is no justification for providing low-cost parking. Parking should be priced at a level that properly encourages increased use of public transport. The unauthorised parking and other off-site parking problems should be dealt with enforcement and other measures, including reducing the demand for parking. The second very special circumstance stated that there was no alternative locations on or off-site for the parking needed. Leaving aside that better promotion of public transport could reduce the parking requirement for the expansion, we have presented evidence during the inquiry that alternative solutions to increase parking provision in the Greenbelt inset have not been properly assessed. In my proof of evidence, I suggested that the capacity of the extensive areas of surface parking in the Greenbelt inset could be significantly increased with the use of single-deck parking added over some of it. The construction costs for this simple form of deck parking are less than those for constructing a multi-storey. Several witnesses to the inquiry, besides ourselves, have suggested that there is room for expansion of car parking within the Greenbelt inset beyond the current proposals. In response to these suggestions, Mr. Melling's rebuttal proof included a visual impact study of a proposal referred to as decked stroke multi-storey located on the Silver Zone car park or the Greenbelt inset. The proposal assessed was a fourth multi-storey or decked parking to a height of 8.8 metres, and this height informed the resulting zone of theoretical visibility. And I'm sorry, I've just used the initials there. Therefore, our more modest proposal for single-decked construction has not been considered in this study. Single decking with one extra storey of parking over surface parking will have a height of a little over 4 metres and not be visible above the ridge of the airport site. The surface parking areas of the Greenbelt inset are mostly located 10 metres or more below this ridge. And that was demonstrated on a plan submitted to the inquiry. Sorry, I haven't given the reference there. So during this inquiry, it was suggested that with the necessary provision of ramps and access, the extra parking provided by a single-decked construction would be limited. However, there is also an option of using valley parking more widely in the Greenbelt inset, and this could include the upper deck of single-storey decking, where no columns would impede vehicle movements. Extending the use of higher density valet parking in the Greenbelt inset does not appear to have been considered either, beyond stating that it is not suitable for multi-storey car parks. The need for and benefits of airport expansion was also considered a very special circumstance justifying development in the Greenbelt. This depends, of course, on it not being possible to reduce the parking requirement and locate that reduced parking requirement elsewhere on the site. XR elders have not presented evidence concerning the economic and social benefits of the expansion of the airport or disbenefits that could weigh against them in the planning balance. We have, however, looked at the forecasting evidence and factors that are likely to influence future demand for flying. It is our case that the likely expansion in passenger numbers recedes further into the future and becomes less certain, or as the likely expansion in passenger numbers becomes less certain, the benefits become less secure and again do not justify development in the Greenbelt. And then just the last word on Greenbelt and policy considerations. Inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, not justified by very special circumstances, is not permitted either by national policy or the development plan. The proposed extension to the Silver Zone car park is located on the southern slope of the airport site within the setting of the AONB and thus a particularly sensitive landscape. The extension site, I think referred to as Cog Loop 2, is currently an important buffer for the Greenbelt, as it is the first green field containing the airport site to the north. Development here would be greenfield development, and the NPPF, paragraph 119, states that brownfield development is to be preferred to greenfield in order that land is used efficiently. It is also a requirement of policy CS1 in the core strategy. There is potential to expand parking within the Greenbelt inset, and national and local policy requires that this option is prioritised over development on green fields. Not only did officers in their report accept inappropriate development in the Greenbelt without adequate evidence, they also agreed a proposed phasing that made this development the first priority. This phasing is now proposed in negotiations around any Section 106 agreement to differ, a sign that BAL understands that the previous position was not compatible with the protection of the Greenbelt required by national and local planning policy. Policy requirements that brownfield sites are developed first should also be applied to the phasing of parking development in the potential draft Section 106. Greenfield and Greenbelt land need to be held back until all other options have been provided. So, a quick word on premature and unjustified. The formal definition of premature development in relation to emerging planning policy documents may not be met in the policy context of this development. However, there is a stated expectation in the justification for planning policies in the development plan that further expansion beyond 10 MPPA should be informed by the production of a development plan document. This would, of course, be subject to greater public involvement and scrutiny. This has not been done, and consultation on the proposals has been cursory, which may partly account for the large number of objections from local residents. XR elders consider that the application is unjustified and premature in the wider sense of the word, in that the need for this further expansion is not clear at present. The airline industry has suffered particularly badly during the pandemic, and it could be well into the future before the already allowed expansion to 10 MPA is reached. And so, to forecasting, which, although we dealt with first in the inquiry, is last in this closing statement. So the forecasts for likely increase in passenger numbers over time were originally prepared before the pandemic. Given the drastic reduction in flights caused by the pandemic, revised forecasts were submitted by YAL in November 2020. The core case prediction in these revised forecasts of 8 MPPA for 2021 is likely in the event to be reduced to less than a half of this figure. Passenger numbers for the first half of 2021 were under 200,000. Further waves of infection and new variants of the COVID-19 virus rendered the revised forecasts out of date within months. In 2021, forecasts from airline industry organisations were all significantly more pessimistic than the revised forecast from YAL. YAL's slower growth predictions were higher than the fastest growth scenarios of the airline industry's most recent predictions. There are no more recent forecasts offering a more optimistic assessment that we can find, and according to recent business surveys, Europe, BAL's main destination, has been particularly hard hit. YAL considers that whatever the drastic impact on the airline business at present, once the pandemic is over, demand will bounce back quickly and continue on its previous upward trajectory. The chief executive of BAL is not so optimistic, however, stating in an interview with Business Live in May that it would take the industry years rather than months to recover, with many people remaining cautious about travelling overseas. We presented evidence on the pandemic that suggests the future trajectory of the COVID virus, variants of concern and even further lockdowns cannot be discounted. There is a threat from the slow rollout of vaccination to populations in developing countries. There will be a continuing adverse impact on air travel from restrictions on destinations and requirements for testing and vaccination. We will learn to live with the virus, but recovery in the airline industry to pre-COVID levels cannot be assumed to happen by next year, which is what the core case of the revised forecast predicts. Mr. Brass, in his forecasting proof, accepted that the YAL faster growth projection is now unlucky. He used the words just about credible. BAL and North Somerset Council are now both effectively just using the core case and slower growth case. In our rebuttal proof, we argued that the forecast should be redone because they were now so out of date. This fudging of predictions and growth trajectories is not, in our view, good practice, particularly in the light of developments in other areas that are likely to also impact adversely on future passenger growth. Mr. Brass acknowledged that the sixth carbon budget could cause some reduction in passenger demand. More recently, the government have issued revised guidelines for the valuation of greenhouse gas emissions. The view from expert witnesses to this inquiry is that the far higher carbon values to be used in project evaluation will eventually feed through to carbon price and cause this to rise significantly. Our submission quotes government intentions to stimulate reduction in greenhouse gases through financial and regulatory instruments, including carbon pricing. Our witness, Mr. Devas, in his proof, argued that YAL's forecasts had not given sufficient weight to likely future rises in fuel price, carbon price, and air passenger duty. The new government carbon valuation guidance makes it certain that the level of these variables used in the forecasting model are far too low. It follows from this that the predictions from YAL are now seriously flawed and over-optimistic, as increases in the cost of flying will reduce demand. Future expansion at the airport has already begun to run into the headwinds of increased carbon taxes as climate change obligations tighten. Delay to the forecast expansion caused by the pandemic has placed the rate of future expansion in doubt. The airline industry and its carbon burden is now in a significantly more challenging financial environment. Additionally, social attitudes to flying and airport expansion are changing as people become more conscious of the risks and causes of climate change. We presented evidence that a shift in attitudes can already be seen, with people increasingly accepting that there is a need to limit air travel. If the 2030s are the likeliest opportunity for numbers at the airport to approach 12 MPPA, developments at Heathrow, particularly the third runway, but also the possible rail link to the west of England, will reduce demand for flights from BAL. The third runway is forecast to reduce demand at BAL by 1 million PPA, according to the Department for Transport's 2017 aviation forecast. Vehicle technological change could also impact on demand for parking after 2030, as acknowledged by the Parking Demand Study and update. So why does this matter? There are significant disbenefits with this proposal that will impact immediately if permission is granted, including extra night flights in the summer month and potential harm to the Greenbelt and AONB, although phasing changes may mitigate this to some extent. Given the additional carbon taxes not factored into the YAL forecasts and the delayed recovery from COVID and ongoing restrictions on travel, it is quite possible that the already permitted expansion to 10 MPA does not happen before 2030. As timelines become more distant, accurate forecasting becomes increasingly difficult. In the case of this proposal, threats to expansion loom in the near future. We have demonstrated there are no very special circumstances justifying the inappropriate development in the Green Belt. As the benefits of the proposal become more distant and less certain, the harm to the Green Belt and the AONB is even harder to justify in terms of being in the public interest. The planning balance of North Somerset officers was, in our view, always too skewed in favour of economic development and gave too little weight to all the adverse impacts evidenced at this inquiry. This led to clear policy mistakes, such as the allocation of land for parking in the Green Belt being given first priority. The refusal of the application by councillors, despite an officer recommendation to approve, is to be commended. It was a necessary correction to the planning balance, with due regard and weight given to all policy concerns and impacts of the development. And so, in conclusion, we find the reasons for refusal were sound and are supported by the evidence, and we respectfully request that this appeal is dismissed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Beth. Okay, we've got PCAA next coming up. We'll have a break for half an hour, so we'll come back at 11:30 and then we'll kick off. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Mr. Morehouse for the PCAA, please.
Thank you very much. I hope people have all had either an electronic or paper version of the document. These closing submissions are made on behalf of the 29 members of the Parish Council Airports Association, and they're focused on specific areas where evidence has been called by the PCAA to identify very real concerns of local people in relation to a number of issues. The submissions fall into two broad areas. All of them relate to the effect on people that live locally to the airport. And the two areas are the local environmental concerns arising directly from the operation of the airport and also the wider impacts of the proposed airport expansion. It's notable, the PCAA says, that notwithstanding issues being raised in relation to both of these areas, that the appellant has singularly failed to address them, either in their original application, which was rightly refused, or in this appeal following the opportunity for the airport to have time to reflect. The local environmental concerns principally arise because of the location and history of the airport development. No person would choose to build an airport in the location that Bristol Airport occupies without addressing fundamental issues in a responsible way. We know until around about 16 years ago that Bristol Airport was a small regional airport, and that it's rapidly expanded over that 16-year period to cater for primarily aviation holidays. The potential business routes, like Frankfurt or to the United States, have a history of being tried and of having failed. The intensity of use in the early part of the 21st century was tolerable for the local community, with local homes historically existing extremely close to the airport operations. The intensity of use was tolerable for the transport infrastructure in place. That no longer remains the case, even without further expansion. The approach adopted by Bristol Airport in expanding rapidly has led to innumerable complaints and problems that remain unresolved. The airport has grown without any of the necessary infrastructure development to support the expansion, the sorts of infrastructure development that would necessitate a web tag analysis, and had a thorough analysis been conducted, this would have been self-evident. The airport's expansion has been accompanied by an emphasis on encouraging car travel to the airport, and this is partly driven by necessity because of the extremely poor public transport infrastructure, but also because the business model of the airport is built on profits from parking. No one would choose to build an airport catering for 10 million passengers per annum that was reliant on a single carriageway A road, however efficiently that could be engineered. The local MP, Member of Parliament, Dr. Liam Fox, who the inspectors will recall was until recently Minister for International Trade, said the following after describing a catalogue of issues in some detail, issues that would not be resolved by the proposed junction alterations to the M5 or the improvements to the A38. He said, "The idea that we should purposely increase the pressure on the system at a time when new housing is being built, which will increase the pressure further, seems beyond reason. Continued expansion on that basis alone is irresponsible, and it's against local planning policy that clearly invites these issues to be addressed before further expansion can take place." Turning to local environmental impacts. There are a number of key environmental impacts, including serious impacts on the local community created by surface access problems and noise, together with the wider impacts on the environment. Cross-examination of Mr. Witchells on the subject of surface access exposed the complete lack of regard for the small communities affected by the traffic that they are exposed to, both airport traffic generated through the operational requirements of the airport and passenger traffic of people using roads other than the A38. In fact, the complaints about surface access that you have heard from the people living in this area do not principally come from people living immediately next to the A38. They come from the residents of villages like Felton and other surrounding areas. There has been nothing to address those legitimate and apparently accepted by the appellant as legitimate concerns. When asked about what was being done to address the concerns of the smaller villages, like using Felton as an example, the only response was that there was going to be improvements to the junction with the A38, making it easier for people to use the rat runs. It was never explained how making it easier for people to use these routes was going to reduce or mitigate their use. How does intensification and surface access provisions deal with the concerns raised in evidence, for example, by Kay and Colin Wooler, who said exhaust fumes from through traffic beyond Winford is very obvious. Much of this is airport bound. Whilst it is a great threat to everyone's health, it is a greater issue for children both at Winford Primary School and especially when going to and from school along the High Street. The airport itself uses caterers based at the former Winford Cattle Market. They use huge unwieldy lorries that are very polluting. Exhaust fumes are evident as they lumber through Winford Village. These are serious environmental issues which have never been addressed and are directly related to the airport's activities. Winford itself is a single-use lane, cannot cope with any increase. Nothing has been advanced by the appellant to address Nick Tyrrell's concerns expressed on behalf of Barrow Gurney Parish Council, and I invite you, I'm sure you recall it from the site visit, but just address the location of that site, which is northwest of the airport, and on the link between the improvements to the A38 and the motorway access point. Nick Tyrrell says the B3130 route through Barrow Gurney Village has long been regarded by many as a convenient shortcut, particularly by taxi companies travelling between the city and the airport, providing a convenient and direct route from the A370 to the A38. It's also a favoured route for traffic from Wales, most of which uses the M49, M5 route to Portbury, then across country to the A38 via Barrow Gurney to avoid Bristol altogether. Jenny Heath, living to the east of the airport in the Chew Valley Lakes. The airport plans for expansion does not include adequate provision for the increased traffic that will be created, putting our country lanes at greater risk of danger, destruction, and disturbance. How does that fit in with policy? The North Somerset Council policy is clear. The core strategy, CS23, proposals for the development of Bristol Airport will be required to demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface access infrastructure. And the Development Management Policy, DM50, requires any airport expansion to deal with these issues. The policy's aim is this, to ensure that if further expansion of the airport is required, proposals demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on those surrounding communities and surface access infrastructure. The proposals put forward do not deal with the principal surface access environmental concerns raised by the communities surrounding the airport. No one is objecting to the proposed modifications to the A38 to make it more efficient, subject to reservations about specific details. It's clearly in everyone's interest to have traffic moving as efficiently as possible. But to repeat, these proposals do not address the environmental concerns. The principal concern raised but not addressed is that primary surface access is reliant on a single lane A road or people travelling across minor roads from the M5 or cross-country from the east. Nothing is put forward apart from minor efficiency savings along one road that addresses this hugely limiting factor. No proper public transport system is proposed. There are no designated bus lanes. There's no mass transit system. In fact, Mr. Melling just last week was quite specific in saying that he didn't consider that it was the appellant's role to provide that. Off-site park and ride capacity is claimed to be unfeasible in compliance with planning policies as part of the appellant's sequential test evidence in relation to the Greenbelt. The real-world physical constraints of surface access infrastructure remain as a constraint to which no solution is advanced for the people who are most affected by the problems it creates. They are physical constraints that, under the present levels of traffic generated by the airport, are regarded as unacceptable by everyone. Everyone, that is, except for the appellant, who, as we have heard, makes significant part of their revenue from parking charges and who therefore have little commercial incentive to resolve them. There is certainly no confidence in the local community that there is any interest in doing so. One only has to consider the historic lack of implementation of the public transport interchange, at the same time as a drive towards provision of low cost, that is low cost to the airport, car parking schemes, to understand the properly founded basis for that lack of confidence. The unambitious 2.5% modal split proposed simply underlines the very real doubt that there's any interest by the appellant in resolving the surface access problems created for the community. Their planning application, as summarised by the local MP, will simply make things worse. The local communities are made up from people that are living with their families, cemeteries being used as toilets, with cars being abandoned for weeks at a time in their villages and country lanes, while people choose not to pay any parking fee at all when they go on holiday, or noise created day and night with traffic passing through, sometimes at speed to get to the airport, and of things like unlawful or roving, unofficial off-site parking that will always exist to undercut the airport rates, because it amounts to setting a rate below that which the airport can set and letting people park up in fields, these car parks despoiling the green belt. Solutions have been put forward to deliver more parking without using the silver extension phase 2, such as the immediate delivery of MSCP 2 and 3 and one-level decked parking, which should be comparable to rates off-site and could protect the green belt. I'm making representations on behalf of most, or almost all of the surrounding parish councils, but these also have to be seen against the context of the democratically expressed will of every council of every political complexion in this area. North Somerset Council, an independent in make-up, the West of England Combined Authority, Bristol City Council, dominated by Labour and the Green Party, Bath and North East Somerset Council. You'll recall Councillor Sarah Warren, the Liberal Democrat councillor, described by the Appellants Council as an extremist in opposing airport expansion, when her party, the Liberal Democrats, were implementing the preceding Conservative authorities' policies, as explained by the next witness, the Conservative councillor Karen Warrington, who followed on to give evidence about the impacts on the communities in Chew Valley area that she represents. There is no support for this proposal across the complete political spectrum, and when deciding the weight that should be given to these local opinions, we invite you to give considerable weight to these democratically expressed views. These views are not unreasonable. They are far from extremist. They are rational views based on the assessment of people living in this area, people that, as part of their elected representative roles within our local community, will clearly be concerned to balance any local economic benefits with the harm that's being caused. They live here. They will live with the consequences of their decisions, and they have roles and duties to consider the alternative balancing of all of these competing interests. It's no accident that they all, from every quarter, and quite rationally, oppose expansion. The appellant, having had these issues raised as part of the rejection of the original decision, has failed to advance anything that addresses these important requirements of North Somerset Council policy. The impact on the communities surrounding the airport at 8.9 MPPA is already at an unacceptable level, and nothing has been put forward that demonstrates a satisfactory resolution of the impact of growth on surrounding communities as part of this application. The failure by the appellant to address the real-world impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface access infrastructure, we submit strongly weighs against allowing this appeal. Turning then to the subject of noise. The level and times of excessive noise is intolerable at 8.9 mppa. Intensification will only make it worse. It is also clear that incremental decreases in noise measured by LAEQ averages will have little real-world benefit for people living under the flight paths when individual aircraft are concerned. Although some may be quieter than previous models, they'll still be sufficiently loud as individual flights to have meaningful deleterious impacts on those living underneath. To quote Ronnie Morley on behalf of people living near Cleve, the airport commences at 0600 hours with a vengeance as multiple aircraft depart at that time. There is usually a flight every 3 minutes in the summer months between 0600 hours and 0700 hours. The noise is considerable and residents are woken on a regular basis. But since 2016, aircraft have been departing earlier than 0600 in summer months. There are now flights from approximately 0400 hours. These aircraft movements again disturb residents. When these flights commenced in 2016, residents complained to the airport, and the issue was discussed at the Airport Consultative Committee, but to no avail. Flights before 0600 have increased yearly since 2016. The timing and frequency of movements during growth to 10 mppa and subsequently have not been considered in the airport health impact assessment, nor within the environmental statements. We request that the frequency and timing of aircraft movements are examined. It should be noted that the appellant's own 2030 fleet mix forecast shows that 27% of aircraft projected to still be in use in 2030 will be existing generation aircraft. The proposed planning approval are for more nighttime flights than Heathrow Airport, the national hub serving London and the UK, the largest airport in the UK. There is absolutely no justification for that. The proposal for removal of the split between summer and winter night flights, meaning that there will be a significantly worse impact at the times of year that people generally want to or need to sleep at night with windows open. Under the presently granted permission, people woken at 6 a.m. and earlier by flights, and examples of those flights were given by Hilary Byrne, who recorded the times of incoming and outgoing night flights. The current levels, 2 hours of flights taking off at a ratio greater than one flight every 4 minutes between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., and again a peak at lunchtime and again in the evening. It begs the question, where are all of the additional flights going to be added? What peace will be left for people living nearby day and night time? There is no peace on the weekends, especially in the summer when people are more likely to want to use their gardens if they could. None of the proposals in this appeal are in accordance with the requirements to address the local environmental impact. Intensification of night flights, a central part of this application, in fact, and completely unnecessarily, does the opposite. In relation to noise and the noise issue, I remind the inspectors of the evidence of Dr. Tricia Woodhead. She said, in the short term, a lack of adequate sleep can affect judgment, mood, ability to learn and retain information, and may increase the risk of serious accidents and injury. In the long term, chronic sleep deprivation may lead to a host of health problems, including obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even early mortality. The WHO reports declare that aviation noise is not just a nuisance and disturbing to those who live under the flight path, but it has a medical and psychological impacts. WHO recommends inside noise levels at 45 dBA or less in the day and 40 dBA at night. Measurements during 2020, 3.5 miles from the airport, in my newly built, well-insulated and double-glazed property, were consistently over 48 dBA when a plane was landing and 55 dBA on takeoff. All windows were shut. You've not been shown any evidence that those studies are wrong. And what is put forward to deal with this, the noise mitigation scheme. Airports are different, as we know, to other planning applications where there are impacts on the local community. Civilian airports fall outside of the ability for neighbours that are affected to claim compensation through the civil tort of nuisance. Those that live within the vicinity of airports are wholly reliant on the compensation scheme put forward. A person whose home is blighted by the noise and aviation fuel, or by passing motor traffic going to the airport, cannot claim as they would in nuisance for the loss of value to their home or for their loss of amenity. We've heard evidence about the inadequacy of the scheme in operation locally, around about £5,000 per property. This was drafted yesterday. I think I've seen overnight it's been suggested an increase to £8,500. If you're lucky enough to be chosen to be one of those recipients, to be the recipient of sound insulation, within a planning context, there is no sharing of the benefits of aviation improvements in noise with the communities affected by the impacts. It's all one-sided, with the benefits going to the appellant. The noise mitigation scheme put forward represents payments far below what would be paid, and I maintain this even with the increased level of noise, as proper recompense under a nuisance action, which those that suffer from the appellant's activities are unable to bring by law. There is no ability to claim for economic impact, for example, on house prices. The scheme itself is wholly inadequate, even with £8,500 per home, to address the very limited area that it's designed to compensate for. We know, and I'm now doing a rule of thumb variation, that it would take, by simple mathematical calculation, around about over 4 years for everyone affected to be able to claim that amount. In fact, if it's the number of applicants, it would remain at over 6 years, because they would simply get more per applicant. The PCAA do not accept that that amount, even at £8,500, is in any way adequate. There's no evidence been put forward to show the cost of windows and ventilation systems by the appellant, and the reality is that you wouldn't get very much change, and I'll stick with those figures, from £5,000 for the replacement of one large sash window or 2 medium-sized windows. It is being extremely generous to the appellant to say that everyone would get their house to a suitably increased level of noise insulation and acoustic protection in 6 to 7 years at the rates of compensation being put forward. The reality is it will take decades, and that means decades of people suffering the ill effects to their health that has been documented. The compensation scheme does not pay anything for the inconvenience of organising the replacement windows. It doesn't address the inability of people to use their gardens to invite family and friends around. It doesn't address the health effects of increased hypertension and all of the other health conditions with associated morbidity increase, not to mention the chronic health impacts before those stages are reached. All of this is documented in fully validated, peer-reviewed medical research. You've heard evidence from Mr. Densham by reference to a letter that he had been sent that the scheme is insulting to local people. It is. It doesn't address the real issues that are experienced. He was to say, we no longer complain, as to do so results in confirmation that there is permission for those night flights. But there seems to be regular flights around 3 a.m. and arriving at about 5 a.m., presumably to be ready for the morning flush out that will awaken us regularly at 6 a.m. Some getting used to it arises in the winter with windows and shutters closed fast, but in the summer it's impossible to sleep through the noise, and with dreadful effects upon our health. And he said, currently when adults visit us, conversations must cease when planes pass overhead. Even now we can no longer carry out charitable events as we used to in the past very regularly because of the noise intrusion. The compensation scheme does nothing to compensate those people whose villages are turned into rut runs for airport traffic or the service vehicles supporting the airport. The combined suggestion that making alterations to the A38 junctions and roundabouts, and that the noise mitigation scheme somehow addresses the environmental concerns is akin to putting lipstick on a pig. By not addressing the real environmental issues and the real concerns, however much lipstick is applied, what lies underneath is still a pig. Finally, in relation to local issues, I turn to the impact on the special area of conservation. This appeal seeks to build a car park on high-value foraging land used by species for which a nearby special area of conservation is designated. The designation of an area as a special area of conservation is because it either contains habitats or species that warrant protection because of threats to the habitat or species. The legal protection surrounding them is intended to give them, in relation to any scheme not directly involved with the management of the site, a high degree of protection from intervention and disruption of the habitats and species protected. If there has to be interference with the sites or the species within them, that protection has to comply with a strict set of rules to ensure that it's justifiable. The process that's been followed has failed to comply with the protective measures put in place to protect that status. There is no doubt that in relation to this appeal that there will not only be interference with the SAC features, but that the plan will both in construction and operation of the car park cause the permanent loss and degradation of foraging habitat that in turn would have a moderate and probably significant effect on the protected species. The protection of these areas is specifically set out in North Somerset and Mendip Batt's SAC guidance on development. And paragraph 2.2 of this guidance specifically deals with the important contribution of the areas around the designated SAC. It says, however, the landscapes around the SAC itself are also important in providing foraging habitat needed to maintain the favourable conservation status of the horseshoe bats. Therefore, the guidance sets out strong requirements for consultation, survey information and appropriate mitigation to demonstrate that development proposals will not adversely impact on the designated bat populations. What is proposed as a resolution to this interference with the SAC are not features intended to either avoid harm or to limit harm to within acceptable levels, such that there is no likely significant effect on the features of the SAC. What is being proposed is that the habitat that is significant in supporting the SAC will be destroyed and will be replaced by replacement habitat elsewhere. In the appellant's own report, the following is advanced. Where existing habitats or features of value to bats cannot be retained as part of the development proposals, the SPD requires a provision of replacement habitat. The surveys undertaken in accordance with the SPD are also required to inform the metric for calculating the replacement habitat to be provided. The SPD sets out precise methodology for calculating an appropriate level of replacement habitat. It continued, an ecological management plan for the site must be provided, setting out how the site will be managed for SAC bats in perpetuity. The PCAA has submitted separate legal submissions on this point, but they can be summarized as follows. Principally, the approach taken cannot be justified in law. And I'll make an aside here because I go on to deal with some cases in these submissions. But the Briels case and the Grace case clearly demonstrate that these sorts of errors are not uncommon. These sorts of errors to take these things into account, because the Briels case is a case involving the replacement habitat being created to offset damage caused to an SAC by a motorway. And in that case, the European Court ruled it is clear that these measures are not aimed at avoiding or reducing the significant adverse effects for the habitat type caused by the A2 motorway project. Rather, they tend to compensate after the fact for those effects. They do not guarantee that the project will not adversely affect the integrity of the site within the meaning of Article 6.3 of the Habitats Directive. Similarly, the Court of Appeal, in the case of Smythe, the law was set out by Lord Justice Sales, and he was to say where and that's my addition, preventive safeguard measures of the kind I have described is under consideration, which eliminates or reduces the harmful effects which a plan or project would have upon the protected site in question, so that those harmful effects either never arise or never arise to a significant degree, then it is directly relevant to the question which arises at the Article 6.3 stage and may properly be taken into account at that stage. By contrast, Lord Justice Sales went on the other hand, where measures are proposed which would not prevent harm from occurring, but which would, once harm to a protected site has occurred, provide some form of offsetting, compensation, so that harm to the site is compensated by new environmental enhancement measures elsewhere, then it cannot be said that those offsetting measures prevent harm from occurring so as to meet the preventive and precautionary objectives of Article 6.3. In the case of offsetting measures, the competent authority is asked to allow harm to a protected site to occur on the basis that this harm will be counterbalanced and offset by other measures to enhance the environment elsewhere or in other ways. In order to allow the harm to a protected site, which Article 6.3 is supposed to ensure does not occur, a competent authority will have to be satisfied that such harm can be justified under Article 6.4, taking account of the offsetting compensation measures at the stage of analysis under Article 6.4. Such measures would not be capable of bearing on the application of the tests under Article 6.3, and so could not be relevant at the Article 6.3 stage. It is clear, beyond any doubt, that the provisions of replacement habitat in this case ought to have followed the procedures set out under Regulation 64 of the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2017. The appellant was obliged to advance imperative reasons of overriding public importance, which carries a different test entirely to that put forward as part of this appeal. The appellant has failed to advance any such IROP grounds that would require quite different considerations to that put forward, as, for example, part of the sequential test for damaging the green belt. As the competent authority required to consider the requirements of the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2017, the PCAA says that the appellant has failed to provide sufficient information to deal with the Regulation 64 grounds, and on that basis that this appeal ought to be refused. I turn now to wider considerations. The alleged economic benefit. Having heard all of the evidence, PCAA continues to challenge the evidence advanced by the appellant to support its economic case. The inspectors will recall that Dr. Chapman raised serious concerns about the approach adopted by the appellant in submitting their economic case for development. Whether the appellant has substantiated a solid economic case is, of course, one of the considerations that the inquiry will need to consider when weighing in the disbenefits of the appeal, and it will be recalled that Dr. Chapman gave evidence that was highly critical of the opaque way that the passenger forecasting and carbon values had been assessed in their modelling, based upon his own direct experience of conducting sensitivity modelling. The consequence of that opaque approach means that there have been significant changes to the carbon valuation policy. It's impossible now to put any reliance on the evidence advanced by the appellant to support these aspects of their case. Just as it was impossible to properly assess the original figures, it's now impossible to unpick the recalculations in view of these changes. Just considering carbon values, despite the Department for Transport guidance in 2020 that analysts should be sensitivity testing high carbon values in preparation for high carbon value policy change, the appellant did not do this. It's meant that the recent wholly expected changes cannot now be meaningfully understood against the evidence originally submitted by the appellant. This failure has an impact both on forecasting values put forward by the appellant as well as on their economic case. The most recent guidance issued by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy on the valuation of energy use and greenhouse gas from July 2021 was a publication providing supplementary guidance to the Green Book. It makes it clear beyond any doubt that the approach adopted by the appellant has significantly failed to properly approach greenhouse gas valuation, not just CO2 valuation, in the planning process. Critically, in this July 2021 guidance note, BIS makes it explicitly clear at paragraph 1.1 It is intended to aid the assessment of proposals that have a direct impact on energy use and supply, and those with an indirect impact through planning. Paragraph 2.7 says, analysts should ensure that all changes in energy use and the UK greenhouse gas emission factor in the interactions that policies and projects in one sector can have on other sectors. For instance, planning decisions may impact on transport emissions, as well as emissions from buildings. This guidance is also absolutely clear that emissions should be monetized. It says, in direct contradiction to the position put forward by York Aviation at paragraph 3.29, once the change in greenhouse gas emissions measured in tons of carbon dioxide, kilotons, resulting from the project or policy proposal has been quantified using the methodology above, these emissions should be given a monetary value. It is important to value both the changes in emissions from fuel use and also the changes in emissions from other sources. The new documents also reiterate the government's position that non-CO2 effects and impacts overseas, that is, including arriving flights, should be quantified. The policy paper states a policy or project that increases or decreases greenhouse gas emissions domestically or internationally relative to a business as usual scenario is required to quantify the change in emissions and then apply the carbon values. The July 2021 guidance note makes it clear, where appropriate, proportionate, and possible to identify the impact of the proposal on emissions overseas, or that occur outside the target framework, example, radiative forcing from aviation, the change in emissions overseas should be valued. As anticipated by Dr. Chapman during the course of this inquiry, the government has published its revised valuation. In relation to revised carbon valuations put forward by the appellant, it's unclear whether construction costs and surface access emissions have been properly treated. And it's clear that the appellant has, in contradiction of BIS guidance, failed to include non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions and overseas impacts. Not only has time shown how woefully inadequate the original submissions by the appellant were, but it is clear that they failed to properly address the changes in their more recent submissions. As set out by Dr. Chapman, with the significant changes to carbon valuation, the increase in the scheme's carbon costs resulting from the new BIS carbon central values means that the scheme's overall benefit cost profile is deeply negative. This deficit grows significantly if the high carbon values are applied, which is appropriate sensitivity testing. We know the likely direction of travel in relation to greenhouse gas emissions based on recent research. What Dr. Chapman's submissions also make clear is that the significant majority, that is more than 85% of the emission costs of this scheme, will not be captured by the UK's current carbon pricing mechanisms. The UK ETS and are therefore not in any way internalised within the aviation sector. As the new BIS carbon values represent an estimate of the true abatement costs of emissions, this means that, at best, this scheme will leave a financial burden on society and future generations worth hundreds of millions of pounds, and at worst, it will deliver as a driver of catastrophic climate breakdown. Carbon, its impacts on this appeal. We must assume that the government will meet its carbon target and impose the necessary policy measures to do that. North Somerset Council have an acknowledged role within that process. Core Strategy 1 requires that development should demonstrate a commitment to reducing carbon emissions. We know that the CCC makes it clear that the government is presently not on target to meet those obligations, and it was unchallenged that the current CORSIA and ETS schemes are not going to achieve the net zero targets. It follows that significant additional action will need to be taken, and increasingly abrupt action will be necessary as time passes to achieve the 2050 net zero legal requirement. The government policy is to permit the continued sustainable expansion of aviation, with affected communities supported and the environment being protected, and is reliant on anticipated carbon efficiency savings in aviation based upon the assessments available as to what those will be. The government has yet to publicly state that they will introduce a mechanism to manage control. In relation to aviation, we know that already built into the system through planning permissions already granted is capacity expansion exceeding the 25% efficiency savings that aviation is expected to make up until 2050. These figures for efficiency savings aren't guesswork. They are based upon the evidence of people working within these sectors, considering technological advances and anticipated efficiency savings. The June 2021 Climate Change Committee Progress Report, relatively up-to-date information so far as this inquiry is concerned, shows that the continued expansion of aviation through the grant of planning permissions already granted will take place. In other words, government policy is going to be implemented. What it also demonstrates is that any continued expansion of capacity will make it significantly harder for the government to meet its carbon budget targets. If that happens, carbon savings will need to be made elsewhere, or, as Mr. Ousand-Ireland said in his evidence, either other sectors will have to suffer disproportionate impacts and or compensation will need to be paid to the airports, given permission that have already been that have to be subsequently revoked. Neither of those economic costs have been factored into the economic benefit or disbenefit forecasts. The government's making best use policy, which itself requires any development to be sustainable, and that development remains subject to the UK's climate obligations, that's explicitly set out in paragraph 1.12, has to be considered against the government's net zero legal obligation and the recent revaluation of carbon and the requirement to account for other greenhouse gas contributors. The policy has so far permitted the grant of expanded aviation capacity that now exceeds any anticipated progress on efficiency savings. The weight given to policies for aviation expansion within MBU has to be measured against all of these additional factors. You will recall that when cross-examining a local business representative, I asked the question whether, while supporting the proposed expansion, any businesses they represented were willing to shoulder the additional burden of carbon reduction to enable the government to meet its legal obligations under Section 1 of the Climate Change Act. Notwithstanding the evidence given by Mr. Ousand-Ireland on behalf of the appellant, it seemed to be a surprise to the business representatives that, as there is a single carbon budget, including aviation, that if airports continue to expand, the requirements for savings will fall elsewhere and possibly on them. Of course, many business owners are acutely aware of the disastrous and costly impacts that climate change will have on their businesses. More than 110 local businesses understand that negative impacts and costs will be real and damaging to business activity. And I cite some of the examples in submissions to the inquiry. The harm will be measured in billions of pounds in increased flood defences, in land given up to the sea as indefensible, in increased food prices for food as harvests reduce in productivity, and in mass displacement of hundreds of millions of people around the globe as parts of the world become uninhabitable through heat or drought, to name but a few consequences. These are all widely recognised results of continuing as we currently are. One of the most memorable witnesses in this inquiry was Terry Burgess, the member of the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, who gave evidence as her own country was cloaked in smoke from the forest fires that are now linked to global warming. Fires that are ironically themselves destroying areas that have been planted up under carbon offsetting schemes. Her clear evidence was that many members and supposed beneficiaries of this appeal do not want their pensions to be making money from this expansion. She was to describe the record temperatures afflicting the town of Lytton in British Columbia, with the whole town burning down 3 days later. The evacuation from their homes of thousands of people in Canada, the crops withering under the heat. One of the features of the modern post-COVID world is that we can now hear evidence from someone who's going from giving evidence to packing their bags in readiness to leave their home because of the encroaching fires, with a fire burning out of control about an hour away from her own home. In relation to climate change, it's important to remember that it is the activities that we have already done, the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that have already been emitted to date, that have brought us to this position. This appeal does not address these environmental concerns in any way at all. In fact, the appellants are inviting, without providing any adequate answers themselves, that the pace of harm be increased. The appellants do not show you how an increase in carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions over and above the already built into the aviation planning process will achieve sustainability. They simply say, without a blush of embarrassment and without reflecting the costs properly in their own economic assessments that will be incurred elsewhere, that it's up to the government to achieve its goals, and that by law we have to assume that they will. That is not an argument that demonstrates or supports the sustainability of their application. It's not only an abrogation of responsibility, but the very silence on the subject evidences the difficulty that will be that will occur in achieving sustainability in the face of the additional contribution to climate change that airport expansion creates. One of the grounds that local democratically elected representatives rejected the proposed expansion was because the appellant had failed to deal with this as part of their original application. And in my submission, they've done nothing since to address that issue. As you are aware from the evidence to this inquiry, this approach is even causing concern within the aviation engineering sector, who fear an abrupt and rapid impact on their business as 2050 comes closer. There are only 28 years left until 2050, and the difficult decisions that need to be taken will need to be taken soon, assuming, of course, we are, as we are reminded by the appellant, that we have to assume that ministers will comply with the law and will achieve the net zero goal. As with the decisions in the inspector's report at Manston, we invite you to conclude that this proposal will make a material impact on the ability of the government to meet its carbon reduction targets, and that this should be given significant weight against granting this appeal. To summarize the PCAA submissions, the appeal should be refused. The appellant has failed to address the actual environmental concerns of local residents, a specific requirement in local policy for any airport development. Any incremental benefits in noise and efficiency will be more than offset by the huge increase in air traffic volumes, and there's no sharing of any benefits. Nothing has been done to address the actual impact on the people most affected by the spatial access problems. Proposals to improve a motorway junction and aspects of the A38 do not address those concerns in any way at all. The appellant has failed to address the issues of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and any weight given to making best use has to be considered against the fact that planning permissions already exist that exceed any expected efficiencies in aviation. Every additional granted development will now materially impact the government's ability to meet its carbon reduction targets. And finally, the development proposed would be unlawful in relation to the approach taken towards the Habitats Directive. An IROPI process ought to have been followed and has not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morehouse. Thank you.
Madam, thank you. If I might be permitted to just make one factual correction, I'm very confident I did not suggest that Councillor Sarah Warren was an extremist, day 2 a.m. She expressed the view in her written evidence that there should be a moratorium on all UK airport expansion, and I think in my questions a view that there should be a stop to any additional flights in the UK, and I think I expressed the view that that position was extreme, but I'd make it absolutely clear, I'm not suggesting that she is an extremist, just that that was an extreme position. So I wouldn't want you or indeed Councillor Warren to go away with the impression that I was making a point about her as opposed to a view she was expressing.
Thank you. Okay. Is there anything to... Okay, thank you, everyone. Unless there are any procedural issues we need to mop up, there's nothing from our end, so that's it for today's session. Tomorrow we'll be back to hear the council's closings, and we'll start at 9:30, but a nice early finish for us. Thank you.
Madam, is 9:30...
Oh, sorry, Mr.
That's all right. Is
Henderson.
9:30 fixed, madam, or can I make a bid for 10 o'clock if it's only us that's being heard tomorrow?
I'm content with 10. Yeah, I'm content with 10 o'clock.
I'm very
yeah.
grateful. That would
Yeah.
help us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks.